I stood next to my wife of 4 years at her cousin's black tie wedding, holding her hand. When the event coordinator asked for our names for the guest list, my wife didn't introduce me as her husband. She didn't even introduce me as her partner. She flashed a nervous smile at a man standing nearby, looked the coordinator in the eye, and said, "Oh, this is Mark. He is just a friend." She thought she was keeping her options open for a wealthy guest she was trying to impress. She didn't realize that in that exact second, she had just signed her own financial death warrant. I didn't scream. I didn't make a scene. I simply smiled, corrected the record, and initiated a sequence of events that would leave her homeless, bankrupt, and begging for forgiveness within 72 hours. The collapse of my marriage didn't happen with a scream or a thrown plate. It happened in the quiet, manicured silence of a vineyard in Northern California. The sun was setting over the hills, casting this perfect golden light that photographers charge thousands of dollars to capture. My wife, Jessica, looked stunning in a dress that I had paid for, standing next to me in the reception line. We had been married for 4 years, together for 6. I thought we were a team. I was 45, a plant manager with a heavy portfolio of investments, and she was trying to get her boutique interior design business off the ground. I had poured capital, time, and emotional energy into her dream. I thought we were building an empire together. We reached the front of the line where a stern woman with a clipboard was checking guests in. She looked at us over her spectacles and asked for our names. Jessica gave hers immediately. Then the woman looked at me, eyebrows raised, waiting for the introduction. I expected husband. I would have settled for partner. Instead, Jessica glanced over my shoulder, her eyes locking onto a tall man in a gray suit standing by the bar. She turned back to the coordinator, flashed a bright, fake smile, and stated that I was just a friend. She said it casually. "He is just a friend." The words hung in the humid air. It wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was a strategic calculation. In that split second, the math in my head rearranged itself. The late nights she spent working, the sudden password changes on her phone, the way she had been pushing me to put her name on the deed to my lake house. It all clicked into focus like a sniper adjusting a scope. She wasn't just embarrassed by me. She was marketing herself to someone else. She was presenting herself as single, available, and unattached, while I stood there like a prop. I didn't freeze. My heart rate didn't even spike. A cold, absolute clarity washed over me. It was the feeling of a business deal going south where you have to cut your losses immediately. I looked at the coordinator, then at Jessica, who was already looking away, dismissing my existence. I spoke clearly enough for the people behind us to hear. I corrected her. I told the coordinator that actually, I was just an ex-husband. Jessica's head snapped toward me, her eyes wide with sudden panic, but I was already moving. I didn't wait for her to stammer an excuse. I didn't wait for the fake laugh. I turned on my heel and walked past the rows of white chairs, past the string quartet playing Pachelbel's Canon, and straight to the parking lot. I could hear her calling my name, sharp and demanding, but I kept walking. The gravel crunched under my dress shoes, a steady rhythm of departure. I got into my truck, the one I had driven separately because Jessica claimed she needed her car for early errands the next day. Now I knew those errands likely involved the man in the gray suit. I started the engine and pulled onto the highway. The silence in the cab was heavy, but my mind was racing at 100 miles an hour. My phone started buzzing on the passenger seat. Jessica, her mother, her sister. I ignored them all. I wasn't interested in apologies or gaslighting. I was interested in damage control. I unlocked my phone and opened my banking app. I needed to see the battlefield. What I saw made my grip on the steering wheel tighten until my knuckles turned white. The joint savings account, the one we used for household expenses and emergency repairs, was almost empty. $7,000 had been transferred out at 9 in the morning, just hours before the wedding. She hadn't just disrespected me. She had looted me. She was funding her exit strategy with my money. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment mistake. This was a premeditated extraction. Then, a new notification popped up. It wasn't Jessica. It was my 16-year-old son, Leo, from my first marriage. He lived with his mom in Sacramento, but he was working a catering gig that weekend. By pure coincidence, he was working at the exact venue I had just left. The text message was short. He asked me to call him immediately. He said it was an emergency. I dialed his number. He answered on the first ring, his voice hushed, like he was hiding in a supply closet. He told me he had seen everything. He told me he wasn't just working the reception. He had been setting up the cocktail area near the side entrance before the ceremony. He told me he saw Jessica with a man, the guy in the gray suit. Leo said he started recording because something fell off. He told me he had a video of them. He described it in painful detail. Jessica wasn't just talking to this man. She was kissing him. But it was worse than that. Leo said he could hear their conversation on the video. He told me that Jessica wasn't just having an affair. She was conspiring. She told the man that I was a boring checkbook and that once she sold the lake house, they would have enough cash to move to the city. She laughed about it. She laughed about how easy I was to manipulate. My son sounded terrified, asking if I was okay. I forced my voice to remain steady. I told him he did the right thing. I told him to send me the video and then wipe it from his phone so she couldn't find it if she saw him. I told him I was handling it. I hung up and watched the video file download. I pulled over to the side of the road to watch it. It was grainy, shot from behind a hedge, but the audio was crystal clear. There was my wife, the woman I had trusted with my life, leaning into a stranger and discussing the liquidation of my assets like she was selling a used car. The lake house she mentioned had been in my family for 3 generations. It was worth over $800,000. She thought she was going to sell it out from under me. She was wrong. I sat there on the shoulder of the highway, the hazard lights clicking in the darkness. I wasn't sad. I was done. The sadness would come later, maybe in a year or 2. Right now, I was a general at war. I looked at the time. It was Saturday evening. Banks were closed. Law offices were closed. Most people would wait until Monday to take action. But I wasn't most people. I picked up the phone and dialed the personal number of Sarah, my corporate attorney. She charged $600 an hour, and she was worth every penny. She answered, sounding surprised. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I told her I needed to file for divorce immediately. I told her I needed to freeze all assets, revoke all powers of attorney, and put a lien on the lake property before the sun came up. Sarah heard the coldness in my voice and shifted instantly into professional mode. She asked if I was safe. I told her I was. She asked if Jessica knew I was calling. I told her Jessica thought I was just a jealous husband driving home to cool off. Jessica had no idea that I knew about the money, the plan, or the video. I told Sarah about the $7,000 missing from the joint account. Sarah paused. She told me that if Jessica had moved that money, she was likely planning to move more. We needed to lock down the credit cards. I had 3 high-limit cards where Jessica was an authorized user. I put Sarah on speaker and opened the credit card apps while I drove. I didn't just freeze the cards. I reported them as compromised. I flagged every transaction from the last 24 hours as fraudulent. I watched the status bars turn from green to red. Canceled. 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 As I pulled into my driveway, the house looked different. It looked like a stage set for a play that had just been canceled. I walked into the kitchen and saw the mail on the counter. There was a letter from a collection agency addressed to Jessica. I had never seen it before. She usually grabbed the mail first. I opened it. It was a final notice for a credit card I didn't know existed. The balance was $12,000. I realized then that the $7,000 she took that morning wasn't for a new life. It was to plug a hole in a sinking ship. She was drowning in debt I knew nothing about. And she was planning to use my inheritance as her life raft. I went upstairs to the master bedroom. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't throw her clothes out the window. That was amateur hour. Instead, I went to the safe in the closet. I punched in the code. It opened. I took out the deed to the house, my passport, and the hard drive with our tax returns. I took the physical evidence of our financial life. My phone buzzed again. A text from Jessica. She asked where I was. She said I was being dramatic and embarrassing her. She said we needed to talk about my attitude. I looked at the message and felt absolutely nothing. She was still trying to play the role of the aggrieved wife. She didn't know the script had been rewritten. She didn't know that she wasn't coming home to an argument. She was coming home to a fortress that had just locked its gates. I typed a single reply. I told her to check her credit cards. Then I turned off my phone, poured myself a glass of bourbon, and waited for the storm to break. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the leather armchair in my study, watching the sun drag itself up over the horizon. The house was silent, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a crime scene before the police tape goes up. Jessica hadn't come home. She had stayed out, presumably with the man in the gray suit, thinking she was punishing me with her absence. She had no idea that her empty side of the bed was the greatest gift she could have given me. It gave me time. And in a war like this, time was the only currency that mattered. At 7 o'clock on Sunday morning, I was already parked in front of a sleek glass building in downtown Sacramento. Sarah, my attorney, didn't usually work Sundays, but she made exceptions for clients who billed as many hours as my company did. And she made exceptions for cases that involved seven-figure assets being threatened by what she called hostile domestic combatants. She met me at the door with 2 large coffees and a look that said she was ready to dismantle someone's life. We went up to the conference room on the 14th floor. The table was a vast expanse of mahogany, soon to be covered in the autopsy of my marriage. I laid out everything I had taken from the safe: the deed to the house, the titles to the vehicles, the hard drive containing 5 years of tax returns, and, most importantly, the printouts of the bank transfers I had found the night before. Sarah scanned the documents with the precision of a surgeon. She didn't offer pity. She didn't offer platitudes about how things would get better. She offered strategy. She told me that we were going to execute a scorched earth policy. She explained that in California, community property laws could be tricky, but fraud pierced the corporate veil. If we could prove she was misappropriating marital funds for an extramarital affair, we could claw that money back. But we needed more than just a few hotel receipts. We needed a pattern. We spent the next 4 hours conducting a forensic deep dive into our finances. It was grueling. It was like watching a slow-motion replay of every time I had been a fool. We traced the money I had given Jessica for her interior design business. Over the last 3 years, I had transferred nearly $60,000 to her LLC. I had framed it as an investment in our future. I believed in her talent. I believed we were building something. Sarah pulled up the business registration and the bank records for Jessica's LLC. She started typing furiously, her eyes narrowing as she cross-referenced the expenses with the tax deductions. She stopped typing and turned the laptop toward me. She pointed to a series of withdrawals. They weren't for fabric or furniture or marketing. They were cash withdrawals. $500 here, $1,000 there, all from ATMs near casinos and high-end bars in the city. Then Sarah found the smoking gun. She pulled up a credit report that I couldn't access on my own. It showed a massive inquiry from 3 weeks ago. A loan application. Jessica hadn't just drained our savings. She had taken out a business expansion loan for $50,000. But she couldn't qualify for that amount on her own credit, which was mediocre at best. She needed a cosigner. I leaned in to see the name on the loan document, expecting to see the boyfriend's name or maybe a predatory lender. I saw the name Robert Hammond. My stomach dropped. Robert was Jessica's father. He was 72 years old, a retired mechanic who lived on a fixed pension in a small paid-off house in the valley. He was a good man. He was the kind of man who fixed my lawnmower without asking and brought fresh vegetables from his garden every Sunday. Sarah explained the implications before I could even ask. She told me that Jessica had likely convinced her father that her business was booming, but she just needed a bridge loan to buy bulk inventory. She told me that Robert had put his house up as collateral, the house he had lived in for 40 years, the house that was his only real asset. I felt a cold rage that was entirely different from the anger I felt about the cheating. Cheating on me was one thing. I was a grown man. I could take a hit. But swindling her own elderly father, risking his roof and his security for a man she met at a bar, that was evil. That was a level of moral bankruptcy that I hadn't thought possible. Sarah kept digging. She traced the disbursement of that $50,000 loan. It hit Jessica's business account on a Tuesday. By Friday, $40,000 of it was gone. It hadn't gone to vendors. It had been transferred to a personal account under the name R. Dalton. Rick Dalton. That was the name of the man in the gray suit. Sarah did a quick background check on him while I sat there, staring at Robert's signature on the loan document. The signature was shaky. He trusted her. He trusted his little girl. Sarah looked up from her screen, her expression grim. She told me that Rick Dalton wasn't a wealthy entrepreneur. He was a grifter. He had a record in Nevada and Arizona for romance scams and check fraud. He was currently unemployed and living in a rented condo he was 3 months behind on. Jessica thought she was running away with a millionaire. In reality, she was funding a con man who was bleeding her dry using her father's retirement. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city. The betrayal had mutated into something radioactive. This wasn't just a divorce case anymore. This was a rescue mission. I realized then that if I didn't act fast, Robert would lose his home. The bank wouldn't care that his daughter lied to him. They would foreclose the moment she defaulted, and she was already defaulting. I turned back to Sarah and told her the plan had changed. I told her I didn't just want to protect my assets. I told her I wanted to destroy Jessica's ability to hurt anyone else. I instructed Sarah to prepare a fraud packet. We were going to document every cent she stole from the business, every lie on the loan application, and every transfer to Rick Dalton. Sarah nodded, a sharp glint in her eye. She told me she would draft an emergency motion for exclusive use of the marital residence, effectively kicking Jessica out. She would also file a lease pendens on the lake house immediately to prevent any sale. But she warned me that the moment we filed these papers, the war would go public. Jessica would find out she was cut off. Rick Dalton would find out the money spigot was dry. I told Sarah to file it all. I told her to have the process server ready for Monday morning. I wanted Jessica served at her parents' house, so Robert would be there to hear the truth. It was cruel, but it was the only way to wake him up before he lost everything. I left Sarah's office with a thick folder of evidence tucked under my arm. The sun was high and bright now, a stark contrast to the darkness of the reality I was living in. I got into my truck and checked my phone. I had missed 12 calls from Jessica. She had left a voicemail. I didn't listen to it. I didn't need to hear her lies. I knew exactly where she was, and I knew exactly where she was going. I drove home, the weight of the secret heavy in my chest. I walked into the empty house, the place that was supposed to be our sanctuary. I went to the kitchen and made a sandwich, eating it standing up over the sink. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. Then, my phone buzzed with a notification from a social media aggregator I used for marketing. It wasn't a text. It was a viral alert. The algorithm had picked up a video that was gaining traction in the local area. The title was "Wedding Fail, Wife Friendzones Husband." My heart hammered against my ribs. I opened the link. It was the video from the reception. Someone had filmed the moment she introduced me as a friend and the moment I corrected her and walked away. It already had 50,000 views. The comments were brutal. They were dissecting her facial expression, her tone, the way she dismissed me. But they were cheering for me. They were calling me a legend for walking away. I realized then that the privacy I thought I had was gone. The humiliation wasn't just in front of her family. It was in front of the world. But as I watched the view count climb, I realized this wasn't a disaster. It was ammunition. Jessica cared about her image more than anything. This video was going to shatter her social standing before the legal papers even hit her hands. I put the phone down on the granite countertop. The pieces were all in place. The legal trap was set. The financial freeze was executed. The public shaming had begun. I was no longer the victim. I was the architect of her downfall. I went upstairs, showered, and laid out my suit for work the next day. I would walk into the plant on Monday morning with my head high, knowing that while I worked, my lawyer was dropping a nuclear bomb on the life my wife thought she had stolen. Monday morning at the manufacturing plant usually began with the roar of machinery and the smell of heated steel, but this particular Monday began with a different kind of heavy atmosphere. As I walked onto the production floor, the conversation died instantly. 200 employees, men and women I had managed for a decade, suddenly found their boots incredibly interesting. I knew why. The video of my exit from the wedding had not just gone viral. It had become a cultural moment. It had jumped from local feeds to national aggregators. It had 3 million views on one platform alone. The title had evolved from "Awkward Wedding Moment" to "The King of Self-Respect." I went to my office, closed the blinds, and focused on the quarterly projections. I didn't engage with the gossip. I didn't check the comments. I let the silence do the heavy lifting. Around 10 o'clock, my administrative assistant, a woman named Brenda who had been with the company for 20 years, brought me a coffee. She placed it on my desk and told me quietly that security had stopped a woman at the gate. It was Jessica. She was screaming at the guard, demanding to be let in. I instructed Brenda to tell security to turn her away and to call the police if she refused to leave. I wasn't going to have this conversation in front of my employees. I was going to have it on my turf, on my terms. She didn't leave the gate for another 20 minutes. My phone lit up with missed calls from her, then from her mother, then from a number I didn't recognize, likely the boyfriend, Rick, realizing his golden goose was being plucked. I continued to work. I reviewed supply chain logistics. I approved vendor contracts. I compartmentalized the chaos into a box and locked it tight. I left work at 5 o'clock sharp. When I pulled into my driveway, her car was there. She was sitting on the front steps of the house, looking like a storm that had run out of rain. Her makeup was smeared, her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she was holding a stack of papers that looked like printouts of the video comments. She stood up as I approached, her posture shifting from defeat to aggression in a heartbeat. She didn't apologize. That was the first thing I noted. She launched immediately into an attack. She accused me of ruining her reputation. She claimed I had orchestrated the video, that I had hired the cameraman to zoom in on her face, that I was paying for bots to leave nasty comments. She screamed that she couldn't go into her yoga studio, that her clients were canceling appointments, that I had made her a pariah. She demanded I release a statement saying it was a misunderstanding, a joke that landed wrong. She wanted me to fix the reality she had broken. I unlocked the front door and walked in, leaving it open for her to follow. I walked straight to the kitchen island, where I had placed the file Sarah had prepared the day before. Jessica followed me, her voice rising in pitch, asking why her credit cards were declined at the gas station. She accused me of financial abuse. She said I had no right to cut her off from our money. I turned to face her. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I spoke with the flat, emotionless cadence of a judge reading a verdict. I told her that there was no our money anymore. I told her that I knew exactly where the money had gone. I watched her face as I said the name Rick Dalton. She froze. The momentum of her anger hit a wall. She tried to stammer a denial, tried to say he was just a client, but I cut her off. I told her I knew about the $40,000 she had funneled to him. I told her I knew about the hotel rooms in San Francisco. I told her I knew about the business trips that were actually weekends spent gambling with my savings. But she regained her footing. She crossed her arms and said that even if it were true, California was a no-fault state. She said she was entitled to half of everything, including the house we were standing in and the lake property. She told me she had already spoken to a realtor about the lake house and that we could sell it quickly to settle things. She had the audacity to try and negotiate a surrender while standing in the ruins of her betrayal. This was the moment. I opened the file and slid a single document across the granite countertop. It was a copy of a listing agreement for the lake house, dated 3 days prior. It had my signature at the bottom, but I hadn't signed it. I told her that forgery was a felony. I told her that attempting to sell a property that wasn't in her name, using a falsified signature, wasn't a marital dispute. It was criminal fraud. I explained that I had already spoken to the real estate agency. They had provided the digital logs of who sent the document. It came from her email address. Her face went pale, losing the flush of anger. But I wasn't done. I pulled out the second document. The loan agreement from the bank. The $50,000 loan she had taken out in her father's name. I asked her if Robert knew that his retirement home was now collateral for a loan she had given to a con man. I asked her if she had told her father that when she defaulted, which she would, because Rick Dalton had already spent the money on a new motorcycle and debts to a bookie, the bank would come for his house. Jessica stared at the paper. She looked at her father's shaky signature. She tried to speak, but nothing came out. The realization of what she had done finally seemed to penetrate her narcissism. She hadn't just cheated on a husband. She had cannibalized her own father. I then dropped the final piece of intelligence. I told her about Rick. I told her that Sarah's private investigator had found his records. I told her he wasn't a venture capitalist. I told her he had 3 other women on the hook in different counties, all investing in his phantom startups. I told her that the moment the money stopped flowing from her accounts, which happened yesterday, Rick would vanish. She shook her head violently. She denied it. She said I was jealous, that I was lying to hurt her because she found someone better. She pulled out her phone to call him, to prove me wrong. I waited. I watched her dial. I watched her wait. I watched the call go to voicemail. She dialed again. Straight to voicemail. She texted. No response. I told her she could keep trying, but he was likely already halfway to Nevada. I told her that she was alone. I told her that the eviction notice for this house was being filed tomorrow morning, but since I was feeling generous, I would give her 1 hour to pack a bag and leave. She looked around the kitchen, the high-end appliances she had insisted we buy, the life she had curated for Instagram. She started to cry, but it wasn't the crying of someone who was sorry. It was the crying of someone who had been checkmated. She asked where she was supposed to go. She said her mother wouldn't take her in if she knew about the loan. She said she had no money for a hotel. I looked at her and felt a profound sense of emptiness. The love I had for her had evaporated, leaving only a dull pity. I told her that where she went was not my problem. I told her she had a friend she could call. I suggested she ask the man in the gray suit for a place to stay. I walked out of the kitchen and went into my office, closing the door. I listened to the sounds of her packing upstairs. I heard the suitcase wheels rolling across the hardwood floor. I heard the front door open and close. I went to the window and watched her walk to her car. She sat in the driver's seat for a long time, just staring at the steering wheel. Then, she started the engine and backed out. As her taillights disappeared down the street, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt focused. The emotional part was over. Now, the legal crushing would begin. I picked up my phone and called Robert Hammond. It was time to tell a 72-year-old man that his daughter had sold him out, and that I was the only one who could save him. Driving to Robert's house in the Central Valley felt less like a visit to a father-in-law and more like a notification of next of kin. I couldn't do this over the phone. You don't tell a 72-year-old man that his only child has mortgaged his twilight years for a fling with a con man via text message. I pulled up to his small, immaculate ranch-style home as the sun was beginning to dip. The lawn was perfectly edged, a testament to the kind of steady, honest work Jessica had apparently despised. Robert welcomed me with a confused warmth. He didn't know yet. I sat him down at his kitchen table, the same table where we had eaten Thanksgiving dinner for 6 years. I laid out the loan documents. I laid out the bank transfer records showing the money moving from the loan disbursement to Jessica's account, and then immediately to Rick Dalton. I watched the color drain from his face. It wasn't anger at first. It was a profound, shattering confusion. He stared at the signature on the loan application, a forgery of his own hand, or perhaps a document he signed thinking it was something else. And then he looked at the repayment schedule. He asked me quietly if this meant he was going to lose the house. I told him no. I told him that I was going to pay off the $50,000 loan the next morning. I explained that I wasn't doing it for Jessica, and I wasn't doing it as a gift. I was buying the debt. I would pay the bank to save his home, and then I would add that amount to the judgment I was seeking against his daughter. I told him that he would have to testify against her. He would have to sign an affidavit stating he never authorized the funds to be used for personal expenses. Robert sat there for a long time, looking at a photo of Jessica on the mantle from her high school graduation. Then, with tears in his eyes, he nodded. He told me to do whatever I had to do. He said he didn't raise a thief. The next 48 hours were a blur of legal violence. Sarah, my attorney, unleashed the full weight of the judicial system. We didn't just file for divorce. We filed for a temporary restraining order on assets and filed a civil suit for fraud, conversion, and breach of fiduciary duty. We submitted the video evidence from the wedding not as proof of adultery, which, legally, didn't matter much in California, but as proof of the timeline. It proved that at the exact moment she was claiming I was just a friend, she was actively conspiring to liquidate marital assets. Jessica was served with the papers at a Motel 6 on the outskirts of Sacramento. We knew she was there because she had used the last $50 on a joint credit card before I cut it off. Sarah told me the process server said she looked unhinged. She tried to refuse the papers, screaming that she had a lawyer, that she was going to sue me for defamation. But the papers were dropped at her feet, and the clock started ticking. The preliminary hearing was set for 3 weeks later. In that time, Jessica's world completely disintegrated. The video had reached 5 million views. The "just a friend" meme was everywhere. But the internet fame was the least of her problems. The real problem was Rick Dalton. As we predicted, the moment the money stopped, Rick vanished. My private investigator found that Rick had checked out of his rental condo the same Monday I froze the accounts. He had blocked Jessica's number. He had deleted his social media profiles. But the investigator found something else, a thread on a fraud watchdog forum. Rick Dalton was actually Richard D'Amico, and he had done this to 4 other women in 3 different states. He had taken the $40,000 Jessica stole from her father and disappeared into the wind. Jessica wasn't just broke. She had been played. She had burned her marriage, her reputation, and her father's trust for a mirage. The day of the hearing arrived. The courtroom was sterile, smelling of floor wax and old paper. I sat next to Sarah, wearing my best charcoal suit, a stack of organized binders in front of us. Jessica walked in 10 minutes late. She looked haggard. She was wearing a dress that was too formal for a morning hearing, something she would have worn to a cocktail party. Her lawyer was a man I didn't recognize, someone who looked like he handled traffic tickets and slip-and-fall cases. He looked unprepared. The proceedings were brutal in their efficiency. The judge, a stern woman named Honorable Edith Chun, reviewed the motions. Jessica's lawyer tried to argue that I had committed financial abuse by cutting off her access to funds. He tried to argue that the "just a friend" comment was a joke taken out of context, and that the marriage was salvageable. He asked for spousal support. He asked for $20,000 a month in temporary alimony. Sarah stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She simply directed the judge's attention to Exhibit C, the forensic accounting of the $50,000 loan obtained through elder financial abuse. She walked the judge through the timeline: the loan taken in Robert's name, the immediate transfer to the boyfriend, the text messages confirming the plan to sell my lake house with a forged deed. Judge Chen stopped reading. She looked over her glasses at Jessica. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. The judge asked Jessica directly if she had used her father's home as collateral for a personal loan to a third party. Jessica tried to deflect. She tried to say it was a business investment. The judge asked again, sharper this time. Jessica stammered, looked at her lawyer for help, and then whispered a weak admission. The gavel didn't bang, but the ruling hit harder than if it had. Judge Chun denied the request for spousal support immediately. She granted me exclusive use and possession of the marital residence. She granted the temporary restraining order freezing all remaining assets. But then she went further. She stated that based on the evidence of potential criminal fraud regarding the father's property and the attempted forgery of the lake house deed, she was referring the matter to the district attorney's office for review. Jessica gasped. Her lawyer looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. This wasn't just a divorce anymore. It was the prelude to an indictment. I walked out of the courtroom feeling a strange sensation. It wasn't joy. It was the satisfaction of a job well done, like a complex engineering problem that had finally been solved. Jessica was standing in the hallway, arguing with her lawyer, who looked like he was quitting on the spot. She saw me and stopped. For a second, I saw the old Jessica, the one who thought a smile could fix anything. She took a step toward me. She said my name. She said that Rick had tricked her. She said she was a victim too. She asked if we could just talk, just the two of us, without the lawyers. I looked at her, and I remembered the wedding. I remembered the casual cruelty in her voice when she erased 6 years of our life for a shot at a stranger. I looked her in the eye, smiled the same polite smile she had given the coordinator, and told her that I couldn't talk. I told her I was just a plaintiff, and she was just a defendant. I walked away, my footsteps echoing on the marble floor, leaving her alone in the cold, institutional light. I had one more stop to make. I had to go to the bank and wire $50,000 to pay off Robert's loan. It was a lot of money, but it was the price of my freedom and the cost of keeping my conscience clean. The war was effectively over. Now, I just had to sweep up the ashes. 6 months after the final gavel fell in Judge Chen's courtroom, the atmosphere in my home had fundamentally shifted. For a long time, the silence in the house had felt heavy, like the pressurized air inside a submarine, constantly waiting for a hull breach. But now, the silence was different. It was expansive. It was the peaceful, uncomplicated silence of a man who had reclaimed the sovereignty of his own existence. The divorce decree arrived in the mail on a rainy Tuesday in November. It came in a standard manila envelope, indistinguishable from a utility bill or a tax notice, yet it contained the legal autopsy of a 6-year relationship. I opened it standing in my kitchen, the granite island cool under my fingertips, the same island where Jessica had once tried to negotiate her surrender with a mix of arrogance and desperation. The document was clean, precise, and absolute. It stated that the marriage was dissolved. It stated that all claims for spousal support were denied with prejudice. It confirmed that I retained 100% ownership of the marital residence, the lake property, my retirement accounts, and the entirety of my investment portfolio. Jessica didn't just lose. She was obliterated. The judge had been ruthless, not out of malice, but out of a strict adherence to the statutes regarding fraud and fiduciary duty. Because Sarah and I had proven that Jessica engaged in financial elder abuse against her father and misappropriated marital funds for an illicit affair, the court viewed her not as a dependent spouse entitled to a lifestyle maintenance, but as a financial liability. She was ordered to repay half of the legal fees I had incurred, a sum that amounted to nearly $15,000. When added to the $50,000 judgment I held against her for the loan I had paid off on her father's behalf, she was technically insolvent. I heard through the grapevine, mostly from a mutual acquaintance who couldn't help but spill the details, that Jessica's life had contracted violently. She was living in a small, one-bedroom apartment in a rougher part of Sacramento, the kind of complex where the police are regular visitors. She was working 2 jobs to keep her head above water. One as a receptionist at a mid-tier car dealership and another waiting tables at a diner on weekends. Her boutique interior design business, the one I had funded and she had used as a front for her affair, had been dissolved, its LLC struck from the registry for failure to pay taxes. But her financial ruin was secondary to her social execution. The Just a Friend video had not just gone viral. It had become a digital artifact, a permanent stain on her reputation. In the modern age, you can move towns, you can change your hair color, but you cannot outrun a meme that has been viewed 5 million times. She had become a cautionary tale in our social circle, a punchline. The wealthy friends she had tried so hard to impress, the one she thought the man in the gray suit would help her join, had all cut her off. She was radioactive. However, the most satisfying closure didn't come from witnessing her misery. It came from the resolution of the loose ends that had kept me awake at night. 3 months into the new year, I received a call from the detective who had been assigned to the fraud case regarding Rick Dalton. They had picked him up in Phoenix, Arizona. He was in the middle of running the exact same scam on a wealthy widow he had met at a golf club. When the Arizona police ran his prints, the warrants from California, Nevada, and Michigan lit up their system. Rick, whose real name was Richard D'Amico, was extradited back to California to face charges. The district attorney didn't need my testimony for the criminal trial. They needed Jessica's. I wasn't there to see it, but Sarah gave me the full report. She told me that Jessica had to take the stand and admit, on public record, how easily she had been duped. She had to testify that the man she destroyed her marriage for had never loved her, had never planned to marry her, and had viewed her simply as a mark, no different from the elderly people he usually targeted. Sarah described the scene as pathetic. As Jessica recounted the details, the motorcycle she bought him, the gambling debts she covered, the lies she told her father, she looked smaller than she had ever been. It was the final humiliation. Rick was sentenced to 5 years in state prison for grand larceny and wire fraud. Jessica avoided jail time by cooperating with the prosecution, but she was placed on 3 years of probation and ordered to pay restitution. This meant that a percentage of her wages would be garnished every single month until the debt was paid, likely until she was nearly 60 years old. I visited Robert Hammond a few weeks after the sentencing. I drove out to the Central Valley on a Sunday, just like I used to when things were normal. The fear that had lived in his eyes during the crisis was gone, replaced by a weary sort of gratitude. I had paid off the bank loan in full the day after the confrontation, ensuring his home was safe. We sat on his back porch, watching the wind move through the orchard. He peeled an orange with his pocket knife, his hands steady again. We didn't talk about Jessica much. He told me that she called him sometimes, usually crying, usually asking for money or for him to intervene with me. He told me that he had learned the hardest lesson a parent can ever learn, that enabling her wasn't helping her, it was only financing her delusions. He told her he loved her, but that his wallet was closed forever. He looked at me, passed me a slice of the orange, and told me that I was the son he wished he'd had by blood. We shook hands when I left, a firm grip between 2 men who had survived the same storm. I still send him a crate of peaches from the farmer's market every summer, and he sends me a card every Christmas. My own life began to expand in ways I hadn't anticipated during the darkness of the divorce. Leo, my son, had been the catalyst for my salvation, and our relationship had shifted from a standard father-son dynamic to something deeper, something built on mutual respect. He had saved me from being the last to know, and I had saved him from a toxic environment. I asked him if he wanted to move in with me full-time for his final year of high school. He didn't hesitate. He moved his stuff into the guest room, which we converted into a gaming studio and study space. We spent weekends working on the lake house. We didn't do it to sell it. We did it to reclaim it. We stripped the weathering off the deck, repainted the dock, and cleared the overgrown brush near the shoreline. It was physical, honest work, the kind that leaves your muscles aching and your mind clear. One afternoon, While we were sanding down the railing, Leo stopped and asked me if I ever missed her. I stopped working and looked out at the water, thinking about the question carefully. I told him that I missed the idea of her. I missed the version of the future I thought I was building. But I didn't miss the woman who could look me in the eye and erase me to impress a stranger. I told him that character isn't what you say you are. It's what you do when you think no one is watching. I told him I was glad I found out who she was before we lost everything. Leo just nodded, absorbing the lesson, and handed me another sheet of sandpaper. He was a good kid. He was going to be a better man than I was at his age. Then there was Sarah. Our relationship had remained strictly professional until the ink was dry on the divorce papers. She was ethical to a fault, which was exactly why I respected her. But the day the final decree arrived, she invited me to her office not to bill me, but to buy me a drink. We went to a quiet bar around the corner from the courthouse, a place with dark wood and low light. For the first time, I saw her without the armor of her tailored suits and legal pads. We talked for hours, not about assets or liabilities or fraud, but about books, travel, and the absurdity of modern dating. It started slowly. A dinner here, a hike there. There was no rush, no frantic need to fill a void. We were both adults who had seen the ugly side of commitment and weren't eager to repeat mistakes. But there was an ease with Sarah that I had never experienced with Jessica. Jessica had always been performing, always looking for the best lighting, the best angle, the best social leverage. Sarah didn't care about any of that. She cared about truth. She cared about loyalty. She had seen me at my absolute lowest, when I was angry and vengeful, and she hadn't flinched. She had handed me the weapons to fight back. 6 months later, I took Sarah to a wedding. It was for a cousin on my side of the family, held at a historic hotel ballroom in downtown Toledo. It wasn't a vineyard, but the atmosphere was festive, filled with music and laughter. As we walked toward the reception line, I felt a ghost of a memory, a cold echo of that moment in the vineyard that had started everything. We reached the table where the coordinator was checking guests in. The young woman smiled at us, pen poised over the guest list. I gave her my name, and she checked it off. Then she looked at Sarah, eyebrows raised in a polite question, waiting for the introduction. I looked at Sarah. She was looking at me, her eyes bright and intelligent, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. She knew the story. She knew the trauma associated with this specific social ritual. She didn't wait for me to speak. She didn't look around the room to see if there was someone more important to talk to. She didn't try to keep her options open. She simply looked at the coordinator and said that her name was Sarah and that she was with me. I took the pen from the coordinator and, next to Sarah's name, I wrote the word partner. It wasn't a grand declaration. It wasn't a viral moment for social media. It was just the truth. It was a word that meant something now. It meant financial transparency. It meant emotional fidelity. It meant that if the world fell apart, the person standing next to you would hold the line, not run for the exit. Later that night, I walked out onto the balcony of the hotel to get some air. The city lights were spread out below me, a grid of golden ambition and quiet lives. I thought about the 4 minutes that had changed my trajectory. I thought about the just a friend comment. It was a sentence that was meant to diminish me, to relegate me to the background of my own life. Instead, it had been the spark that burned down a forest of lies and allowed something real to grow in the ashes. I had my dignity. I had my son living under my roof. I had my financial freedom secured. And I had a woman who knew the value of the man standing next to her. I took a sip of my drink and felt my phone buzz in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a notification from my bank app. The monthly garnishment from Jessica's wages had just been deposited into my account. It was $214.37. It wasn't a life-changing amount of money. It barely covered the cost of a nice dinner for two. But as I stared at the screen, I smiled. It wasn't about the money. It was about the reminder. It was a monthly confirmation that actions have consequences. It was a recurring message from the universe that the truth eventually wins, even if it takes a scorched earth legal campaign to get there. Some mistakes you pay for with interest. Some betrayals you pay for with your life. And some men, the quiet ones, the ones you think you can discard like an old coat, are the ones who end up writing the history. I put the phone back in my pocket, turned away from the railing, and walked back inside toward the music. Sarah was waiting for me on the dance floor. And this time, when the music started, I didn't walk away. I stepped forward.